This is Kyoto before the samurai, before tea ceremonies, before katanas and shoguns. The court here is ruled by poetry, silk, and sighs. Everyone is watching, pretending not to watch. Everyone is writing, pretending not to care who reads it. And behind one of those screens, a young woman sits alone, ink-stained fingers, eyes like moonlight. Her real name is lost to time, but her pen name survives, Lady Murasaki. She watches, she listens, she begins to write. You don't know it yet, but you're about to fall asleep beside the world's very first novelist. Her story is quiet, like a passing breeze, but it lingers long after the wind has gone. The Heian court breathes in rhythm with ritual. Every movement here feels like choreography, measured, practiced, adorned. You glide barefoot along a corridor of polished hinoki wood, catching the faint scent of cypress. Shoji screens slide open and closed with barely a sound, revealing glimpses of noble women, swaddled in 12 layers of silk, each layer chosen not for warmth, but for perfect seasonal color coordination. Dressing takes hours. Sneezing in the middle of it would be a tragic poetic disaster. You pass one lady-in-waiting bowed low her head, nearly brushing the tatami floor. Another wafts by, holding a fan in front of her face, more to veil her expression than to cool it. Nothing is what it seems here. Every smile could be sorrow, every poem a warning, and every love affair a footnote waiting to be misinterpreted by historians centuries later. Historians still argue whether the Heian court was a hotbed of artistic freedom or just a very fancy prison made of perfume and calligraphy. The lines blur, and that ambiguity is half the point. You pass into a wider space now, a moonlit garden visible through an open veranda. The breeze rustles through bamboo, and a pair of nightingales exchange their notes like secret lovers. In the center of the garden, a stone basin overflows gently with water, a silent reminder that beauty here is measured in how gracefully it fades. The cherry blossoms last just a week. Sometimes the stories last longer. And that brings us back to her Lady Murasaki. She's not yet a lady, not officially. Right now, she's simply Fujiwara no Takako, born into a minor branch of a powerful clan. Her father is a scholar, a man who reads Chinese poetry aloud and secretly teaches his daughter the same, even though officially it's considered improper for girls. You watch the child in a small chamber hunched over a scroll. Her brush moves slowly, deliberately. She's copying Confucian texts by lamplight, lips moving in silence, eyes flicking occasionally to the doorway. If her mother notices, she'll likely say nothing. In this court, silence is both punishment and permission. She writes slowly, but she sees fast. Even now, her mind is gathering everything, expressions, tones, tiny hesitations, whispered regrets. One day, she'll thread them into fiction, so real people will wonder if it's autobiography disguised by romance, or romance disguised by sorrow. The Tale of Genji will be born not from fantasy, but from here, from the golden trap of the Heian court. Outside a gong sounds, time to sleep, or pretend to. You linger a little longer. The young girl is extinguishing the lamp, the paper-thin flame swallowed by night. She slides beneath silk, bedding eyes still open. Perhaps she's composing a poem in her head. Or maybe she's imagining a prince with too many lovers and not nearly enough sense. A character just like her father, or her first heartbreak, or no one at all. You lie back, too, in the quiet of this imagined world, letting the hush of ancient Kyoto lull you. She hasn't written a word of her novel yet, but already the world around her is turning into fiction. Morning comes softly, not in a burst of light, but in a slow, drowsy drift. The shoji screens glow pale with dawn, and the hush of the garden deepens as if even the cicadas are holding their breath. You stir not with urgency, but with the measured grace the court expects. There is no rushing here, no slamming of doors or alarms blaring, just the deliberate rhythm of a world that values subtlety over speed and poetry over practicality. Even waking up is a performance. And somewhere in another wing of the residence, Fujiwara no Takako, who will one day become Lady Murasaki, is rising too, slipping into the first of many silk layers, each chosen, to complement the delicate blush of the morning sky. At barely 10 years old, she's already fluent in more seasonal color schemes than you could name in English. The hem of her robes trails behind like a petal in the breeze. She isn't royalty, but she's close enough to observe them. The Fujiwara clan, her family, has long mastered the art of court manipulation. They marry their daughters into imperial lines like strategic chess moves, consolidating power through wedding vows and lullabies. And yet Takako's own future feels oddly undefined. Her father, an intelligent but unremarkable bureaucrat, doesn't quite know what to make of a daughter who quotes Chinese poetry better than most tutors. So he does something quietly radical. He lets her read. You sit with her now hidden behind a paper screen while she pores over an old Confucian scroll. The ink is faded, the edges frayed, but her concentration is razor sharp. She traces each character slowly with her finger lips, moving silently. The characters are technically forbidden, to her Chinese writing being considered inappropriate for women who were meant to focus on kana, the simpler native script. But her father turns a blind eye, or maybe both eyes, with a knowing smile. Historians still debate whether he taught her out of progressive beliefs or simple affection. Either way, it shaped the future of literature more than he could have imagined. After all, the first novelist in the world wasn't just a woman, it was his daughter. Her days pass in patterns: morning study, afternoon etiquette lessons, evening poetry, and everywhere observation. She watches as older women of the court paint their faces with white rice powder eyebrows removed and redrawn high on the forehead, like clouds floating above serenity. She watches as courtiers speak in soft riddles, laughter trailing behind like incense. Every gesture, every pause, every loaded silence, she absorbs it all, a living journal without pages. One afternoon, you find her in the garden, knee-deep in the grasses, behind the formal walkways. She's not supposed to be there, of course. That patch is for servants, not court ladies. But she's chasing dragonflies and whispering stories to herself. One insect has torn its wing. She lifts it gently with a leaf, sets it on a rock, and murmurs something half poem, half prayer. Later, she'll remember that moment. She'll write it into a character, perhaps a prince watching his first love fade, or a lady exiled to the countryside. Her fiction will carry the weight of small truths wrapped in silk and metaphor. You linger beside her as the sky shifts again. A storm threatens on the edge of the horizon, the kind that never quite arrives. The air grows heavy like a secret unsaid. The palace prepares for another night of banquets and court recitals, and she will be expected to smile, to observe, to listen, but not yet to speak. And so she writes in silence. She begins a diary, not the kind for crushes or complaints, but a chronicle. A record of the court's strange ballet, of the clumsy flirtations and the quiet betrayals, of which noblewoman wept behind which curtain, of which poem offended which rival, and how many syllables it took to ruin a friendship. Her words are subtle, but sharp. They reveal more than they say. You sense it in the rhythm of her brushstrokes. The ink isn't just recording, it's shaping. She's building a mirror and a mask all at once. And here's a fringe detail you might not have known she wrote with ink, made from soot and glue pressed into tiny inkstones mixed with the water she sometimes collected herself. She preferred writing at night when the court was quiet, and the candles flickered like gossiping spirits. Some even claim she talked to herself as she wrote, murmuring dialogue under her breath. You imagine that now a girl with ink-stained fingers whispering to imaginary princes while the real ones snore in rooms nearby. Back in the present, you feel yourself drifting again. The palace dims with dusk. Lanterns are lit one by silent attendants, and shadows lengthen like spilled ink across the floor. You return to the corridor where she first caught your eye, the one with the folding screen painted with cranes. She's gone from view, but you can almost hear her thoughts echoing softly between the walls, and perhaps that's the strange magic of Lady Murasaki's world. It was never meant to be loud. It was meant to linger, to whisper, to draw you in line by line until fiction and memory blur and the past becomes a dream you can't quite wake from. Sleep is close now, but so is the next chapter. The hush of evening is always when the words come easiest. You find yourself once more in a quiet corner of the Heian Palace, this time not watching but listening. The sound is soft at first, almost imperceptible brush against parchment ink, sliding in graceful arcs, the faintest sigh as a thought escapes into writing. Lady Murasaki still, just Fujiwara no Takako. To her peers has begun her diary. No title, no flourish, just raw, contemplative notations about her life at court. But oh, how carefully she chooses her words. Every sentence is a little trap door dropping you into something deeper. A sly comment on a nobleman's appearance, a metaphor for loneliness, veiled behind moon imagery, a vivid recollection of a conversation behind a curtain cloaked in subtle venom. You sit beside her now. She does not mind your presence. Few people notice when you sit quietly enough in the corners of history. The diary she writes will later be known as the Murasaki Shikibu Nikki, though she never names it herself. Some say it was merely a record of days. Others believe it's a proto-novel in disguise. Historians still argue whether she wrote for herself for posterity or for revenge, because when you're a woman in a court full of men with delicate egos writing truth, even prettily can be dangerous. She keeps the diary folded into the sleeve of her kimono. Not hidden, not flaunted, just tucked there. Private like grief or ambition. You watch her write by the low flicker of an oil lamp made from whale fat, its scent sharp, earthy, and strangely comforting. Her hair falls in a single uncut sheet of black down her back, glistening in the firelight like silk spun from ink. No elaborate style, yet just a girl alone with her thoughts. But those thoughts are coiled tight. They're going to grow teeth. Today she records a poem whispered by a passing nobleman, one intended for a different woman entirely. She writes it down anyway, for accuracy, for safekeeping, for comparison, maybe even for mockery. The man had no idea she was listening, which makes the moment twice as delicious. You find her doing this often, recording court happenings not as they appear, but as they truly feel. The grand occasions, yes, the poetry competitions, the seasonal banquets, the formal rituals where sleeves must hang, just so, but also the awkward silences, the jealous glances, the perfume-covered tensions humming beneath every compliment. And she doesn't simply observe, she translates. Not into another language, but into meaning. She transforms the court's exquisite artificiality into something profoundly human. A diary, yes. But more than that, a blueprint for fiction. And if you listen closely, you'll hear it beginning to change her. Take today, for instance. She watched a lady of the court drop her fan in front of the emperor's nephew. A simple accident, it seemed. But was it the woman's sleeve had flicked just the right way? The fan had landed just where the nephew had to bend over to retrieve it. Their hands brushed. Eyes met. A poem was exchanged by dusk. Murasaki records all of this, not as a voyeur, but as a cartographer of emotion. And later alone, she wonders aloud, what would happen if the nephew fell in love? What if he wrote back? What if he couldn't stop? That's how it begins. Not the Tale of Genji, not yet, but its bones. She doesn't know she's writing the first novel. She doesn't think of it as inventing a genre. She's just trying to make sense of what she sees. But slowly, the diary grows teeth. Characters begin to emerge, not just real courtiers with altered names, but fictional personas infused with too much truth to be coincidence. Her notes become little portraits. The beautiful but cruel lady, the charming prince with a self-destructive streak, the aging noble desperate to be remembered for something, anything, besides his declining teeth. And somewhere in that mix, the ghost of Murasaki herself. You turn the pages with her. The paper is soft, fibrous, faintly textured beneath your fingers. The ink bleeds slightly, giving each word a shadow. You catch glimpses of things not said, a line that begins with a season and ends with a heartbreak, a haiku that sounds innocent until you hear the tone. Here's a quirky detail. Noble women of her time often composed poems to each other as flirtation, as apology, or even as subtle insults. The right poem could end a relationship. The wrong poem could start one. One syllable out of place, and you were the talk of the palace for weeks. It's like Twitter, but with more robes and fewer typos. You smile as Murasaki recounts an exchange between two rival ladies. One sent a poem comparing the other's perfume to overripe fruit. The response, a haiku about wilting blossoms and jealous bees. It's ridiculous. It's brilliant. And she writes it all down. The diary fills. The pages pile up. She folds each one, carefully stores them in lacquer boxes, ties them with silk ribbon. Not for publication, not even for sharing, but to keep a piece of herself preserved in a world where women are taught to vanish gently behind curtains and conventions. You lean back. The lamp flickers. The court has quieted for the night, its many performances tucked under embroidered quilts. And Murasaki sleeps beside her words, curled like a brushstroke. The diary, resting just inches away, breathes with secrets. And you still beside her, in this world of shadows and sighs, begin to wonder what kind of story she'll tell next. The screen slides open with barely a sound. It's morning again, or perhaps a dream of morning, one of those pale, drifting beginnings where the light doesn't feel like it comes from the sun, but from the air itself. You're back in the palace, back in Murasaki's world. And this time you're sitting in on a lesson you were never supposed to see. Behind a curtain embroidered with cranes and chrysanthemums, a young Murasaki kneels quietly beside her father. He holds a brush like a warrior holds a sword, confident, precise, but never careless. Across from him, she mirrors the gesture, her tiny fingers slightly ink-stained, her sleeves pushed back ever so slightly. Improper. Delightfully so. You lean forward. He's reading aloud from The Analects of Confucius, one of the foundational Chinese texts. Officially, it is forbidden for women to study this material. Unofficially, if no one sees, no one knows. And if no one knows, perhaps it never happened at all. But it is happening, and it's changing everything. Her father, a middle-ranking court scholar, isn't exactly a radical. He isn't protesting in the halls or writing treatises about gender equality. He's just a man who has noticed something strange about his daughter she understands. She remembers. She sees. So he teaches her, in whispers, in shadows. In the soft hours when the rest of the household is still asleep or pretending to be. You sit beside her now, brush in hand, trying to follow the strokes. Chinese characters intricate and bold flow like water from his wrist. She mimics them not perfectly, but with startling intuition. He nods in approval. Her eyes flick up just for a moment. Not pride. Something deeper. Something that almost looks like defiance, but softer. Like rain challenging stone. She's learning more than calligraphy here. She's learning language as power. Historians still argue whether this quiet education was truly secret or just conveniently forgotten by record keepers who preferred their heroines modest and mute. But the truth is always a little blurry around the edges, especially in a world built on appearance. Murasaki will later say that her knowledge of Chinese texts helped her understand the deeper moral dilemmas her characters face. And it shows. The Tale of Genji isn't just a romance. It's a philosophical landscape wrapped in lace, a long drifting reflection on human weakness, impermanence, and what it means to desire something you can never fully hold. You think perhaps that this understanding began here behind the screen, in a room not meant for scholars, with a girl not meant to become one. The lesson ends with a bow, a smile, and a shared secret. You trail behind her as she leaves the room carrying her brush and her thoughts like twin blades tucked into invisible sleeves. Outside the court is already in motion. Courtiers practicing their poetry, servants carrying trays of lacquerware filled with breakfast delicacies you can't quite name, but definitely wouldn't mind tasting. Somewhere a lute begins to play. Somewhere else, a lady sighs dramatically into her sleeve. It's all very aesthetic. But you follow Murasaki to a quieter place, a small alcove overlooking the garden, her sanctuary, though no one calls it that. She spreads out her scrolls. You watch as she begins to copy passages from a new Chinese text this time, with annotations in Kana Japanese script. She's translating as she goes, turning Confucian aphorisms into something softer, something digestible for her own reflection. Or maybe for someone who hasn't been born yet, and it hits you she's building a bridge. Between languages, between cultures, between worlds. And that's the thing about women like Murasaki. They don't shout. They build bridges out of silence. Here's a quirky tidbit. In Heian, Japan, women weren't supposed to speak Chinese, but many could read it in secret. This led to a whole genre of female literature that borrowed Chinese literary structure, then hid it beneath elegant kana poetry. It's like smuggling philosophy inside a haiku. Subversive. Stylish. You wonder now if she knew what she was doing. If she realized even then that her words might outlast everything else, her name, her status, even the palace walls. There's a moment of stillness. The garden ripples in a sudden breeze. A few blossoms drift down, landing softly on the page she's working on. She doesn't brush them away. You lie down next to her, just for a moment. The floor is warm from the morning sun. The faint scent of ink mingles with plum blossoms and ash. And for a heartbeat, it feels like you are not reading history, but living inside it. She's still scribbling, still learning, still stretching that strange, beautiful brain of hers into spaces where girls weren't supposed to go. You hear the rustle of her sleeves, the scratch of the brush, the heartbeat of a novel not yet written, but already real. You close your eyes, the lesson lingers, and in your half-sleeping mind you wonder what else she's going to teach you without ever raising her voice. You awake, or at least you think you do, to the rustle of silk and the scent of incense, smoldering gently in a bronze burner shaped like a crane. Somewhere behind you, wine chimes tinkle against a lacquered beam. It's morning again, or maybe afternoon. The hours in the Heian court drift without edges. You rise slowly and follow the familiar whisper of movement through the palace corridors, your bare feet cushioned by tatami mats. The air is thicker here, scented with plum blossoms and political tension. You've entered the women's quarters, where the real power hums behind every veil, where no decision is ever truly final until it's whispered in this wing. Lady Murasaki lives in this space now, or rather she survives here. Officially, these are the quarters of Empress Shoshi, a woman carefully elevated to status by the ever-meddling Fujiwara clan, Murasaki's own kin. You trail her down the painted hallway where lanterns swing like breathing lungs and polished doors close without sound. She moves with grace, not because she's trying to impress anyone, but because being clumsy here is dangerous. Every misstep ripples. Murasaki no longer studies by candlelight at her father's desk. Now she sits among other women of rank ladies-in-waiting attendants, poets, companions, all dressed like blossoms, all trained to speak with gentle half-smiles and ambiguous metaphors, and yet few speak with her. Not because she's disliked, but because she watches too closely. You sit with her on a cushion beside a low table, lacquered in black and gold. Before her lies a scroll of poetry from a rival lady folded just so. The calligraphy is flawless, the meaning passive-aggressive at best. You lean in, Murasaki lifts her brush, and instead of a polite response, she begins to write something else entirely. A passage about a man, a prince, perhaps watching his beloved from behind a screen. His desire tinged with melancholy. His thoughts wandering from duty to longing and back again. The character doesn't exist yet, but he's starting to breathe. Genji. He doesn't even have a name on this page, but the idea is there. The way he moves, the way he's watched, the way he watches others. Murasaki folds the scroll quietly, as if she's hiding a secret in plain sight. And here's the irony. This world so tightly ruled by men is being meticulously documented by the women they overlook. The court's male officials pen dull reports, dry political memoranda, lineage, records thick with self-congratulation. But in the women's quarters, in the twilight of rooms filled with whispers, the true stories are being written. Historians still debate how much of Murasaki's writing was allowed and how much was merely tolerated. Some argue she was quietly encouraged by the Empress herself. Others think she wrote in rebellion, an act of resistance disguised as courtly entertainment. The truth as always floats somewhere in between. You follow her gaze across the room. Other women giggle softly, composing love poems for imaginary admirers. One writes a haiku about a fish she saw once in a dream. Another carefully chooses scented paper for her next reply. Will it be lavender or plum blossom? It matters. Everything matters. Even the scent of a poem could change its meaning. Here's a quirky tidbit. Perfume was so integral to court life that women often competed by layering different fragrances to create the most alluring signature. They would burn incense into their clothing, letting the scent settle deep into the fabric. A well-composed perfume was a poem in itself, and some women, Lady Murasaki included, became legendary for it. You lean close. Her robes carry a faint trace of sandalwood and iris, but her words, they smell like ink and quiet rebellion. This is the paradox she lives in, a world that asks her to be invisible while she writes things no one can forget. Later, in the hush of twilight, she walks alone through the veranda, watching clouds stretch over the palace rooftops. Her hands are folded. Her mind is not. She has spent the day being agreeable, deferential, ladylike. But now the mask is slipping. Her diary waits. The ink is ready. And the character that has been forming quietly all day begins to speak. Genji, prince, politician, poet, philanderer, a man with too many lovers and not enough foresight. He begins to take shape in the corners of her mind. You follow her back inside. She unrolls a blank scroll, dips her brush, and writes. The words flow slowly at first, then faster. A scene unfolds. A courtier slips through a moonlit corridor. A curtain flutters. A poem is left on a pillow, its meaning half metaphor, half apology. You wonder briefly who she's writing about. An emperor's advisor, a lover from years ago, herself in disguise. But she gives you no answer. Just the sound of ink scratching across the paper. Just the soft breath of a world forming beneath her hand. The Tale of Genji doesn't exist yet, but tonight it is closer. The palace is quiet now. Too quiet for drama, too late for duty. But just right for a woman to sit with her words and build a new world. One where fiction tells the truth, and the truth wears a veil. You lie down again beside her. Not too close. Close enough. You blink, and the palace has dimmed again, lamplight flickering like the breath of a tired story. The hush has settled deeper now, not the silence of peace, but the silence of watching. You find Murasaki once more, this time, sitting by an open screen as the wind stirs a single paper lantern above her head. She is older now. Not old, just worn soft in the way silk becomes smoother with handling. Her posture straighter, her eyes sharper, her silences heavier. The women around her still speak in hushed tones, still pretend not to notice her too closely. But there's a difference now. Murasaki has begun to write seriously. By day, she plays the part of lady-in-waiting to the Empress Shoshi, smiling when expected, listening when needed. But by night, she writes with purpose, not for gossip, not for confession, but for something else entirely, to give shape to a world no one else dares describe honestly. You peer over her shoulder. The scroll is longer now, the character clearer. Genji. His name now inked with certainty, his flaws unfolding with elegance. He is beautiful, talented, tragic, arrogant, somehow charming in all the worst ways. You get the sense that Murasaki both admires and disapproves of him. Perhaps these many men she's known all distilled into one infuriatingly dreamy figure. And then the story blooms. Genji seduces his stepmother. Yes, his stepmother. A scandalous plotline even by today's standards. You glance at Murasaki sideways, wondering if she smiled while writing it. Historians still argue whether this was based on a real affair whispered about in the Heian court or whether it was pure invention, the quiet vengeance of a woman boxed in by elegance. But she doesn't tell, she just writes. She captures details you wouldn't expect. The texture of a robe, the awkwardness of a morning after, the way someone avoids eye contact after a poem falls flat. She describes women not as idealized angels, but as complex, jealous, bored, clever kind, cruel. Sometimes in the same scene. You start to see what she's doing. She's turning the entire Heian court into fiction, carefully without names. But if you know the players, and you do, you see them. One lady described as delicate but vain bears a striking resemblance to a certain rival of Murasaki's, perhaps Sei Shonagon, the brilliant and biting author of The Pillow Book. Their rivalry is never recorded outright, but you can feel it, tension wrapped in silk, sharpened with calligraphy. Here's a detail to savor. Sei and Murasaki were both brilliant women, writing in the same court at the same time, but in wildly different styles. Sei's Pillow Book is all wit and fragments and gleaming observation like a tray of fine sweets. Murasaki's Genji is slow, woven brooding like a deep river, smooth on the surface but strong beneath. Some scholars imagine them rolling their eyes at each other in passing. Others suspect grudging admiration. Either way, the literary energy in the Empress's chambers must have been electric, or at least politely resentful. You trail Murasaki through the evening. She moves with purpose, now scrolls wrapped in cloth tucked inside a lacquered writing chest. She stores them not in her private quarters, but in a chest beneath the Empress's bed, perhaps for protection. Perhaps because even now she can't quite believe what she's doing is allowed. Because it isn't. Not really. Women weren't supposed to write epics or dissect emotion, or whisper secrets that mirrored real power. And yet there it is, the scroll grows longer, the tale thickens. You read over her shoulder as Genji meets a new lover. The description is so vivid you feel awkward, like eavesdropping on something too real. But that's the genius. The world she creates is so carefully crafted, you don't notice when it becomes your own. And the court notices too. Not openly, of course, that would be improper. But behind fans and in poetry circles, they murmur, "Have you read the next chapter? Is Genji based on Lord So-and-so? Did you notice the way she described Lady X's voice?" Oh, yes, they notice. There's a power in fiction. It disguises truth just enough to make it safe to speak. You find yourself wondering as Murasaki leans back and stretches her arms whether she feels proud, or just relieved, or maybe nothing at all. She doesn't smile. She doesn't boast. She just picks up her brush again and writes. You sit beside her long after the palace has quieted. Even the insects have grown still, the soft scrape of the inkstone, the only sound in the room. And outside, the moon has risen pale and heavy, watching as another chapter takes form beneath her hand. There's no applause, no ceremony, only a woman in shadow writing a world more real than the one she lives in. The palace is quiet but not asleep. Candles still flicker faintly behind the paper walls. Somewhere a courtier is whispering a last poem into the night, hoping it reaches the right ears. Somewhere else a woman dreams of her ranking slipping a single position in the emperor's favor. That's how delicate this world is. One missed glance, one misfolded sleeve, one syllable off in a love poem and your future becomes past. You follow Murasaki as she walks alone through a breezeway between buildings, her sleeves brushing the lacquered railing like whispers on wood. She's humming softly, not a tune exactly, but a pattern, perhaps words from a scene she's turning over in her mind. You lean in curious. Is this a lover's confession? A moment of shame? A death scene even? She stops, and there in the soft glow of moonlight unrolls a new scroll. Not a diary entry this time. Not a poem. No, this is something larger. The tale of Genji has begun, really begun. The first chapter now complete, she returns to it with a practiced eye, not as a writer in awe of her creation, but as a surgeon. She trims, she softens, she moves commas like pawns in a chess game. It must be perfect, not because perfection is expected, but because it's the only armor she has. And yet she doesn't stop at beauty. She makes Genji suffer. You see it as she rewrites the romantic hero brought low by longing, by rejection, by his own indecision. He falls for women he cannot have. He loses those he treasures. He chases what will ruin him. A man of rank adored by all, undone not by war or scandal, but by love that is never quite enough. You wonder now, was that the plan? Or did he surprise her too? Historians still argue whether Murasaki wrote Genji to flatter the court or to criticize it. Some say she was gently mocking the men who thought themselves too poetic to be foolish. Others believe she was mourning something, a love lost a future, denied a world slipping away like cherry petals in a river. Either way, you feel the weight of it now. She isn't just writing a story. She's writing a map of sorrow. But she wraps it in beauty, so much beauty it almost distracts you from the heartbreak at its core. That's the trick. As you trail her into the room again, you see the women of the court gathered for a poetry salon. An informal affair, pillows scattered in a circle, a tray of pickled plums, scrolls neatly stacked. A cat wanders through the gathering tale high, utterly unimpressed by any of it. Murasaki sits near the edge, not quite at the center, but not far from it either. She listens more than she speaks, her gaze flickering like lantern light. Each poem recited is met with nods, murmured praise, the occasional well-practiced blush, and yet none compare to hers. When Murasaki finally speaks, finally shares just a short passage from Genji, the room stills. Not out of fear, out of recognition. It's as if someone has described a dream they didn't know they all shared. You watch the others react. One lady presses her fingers lightly to her lips. Another glances sideways, unsure if she's being written into the story. A third looks at Murasaki with a strange softness, something between envy and awe. That's when you realize Genji isn't just fiction anymore. He's part of the court now. He's slipped behind the curtains, sat at their banquets, whispered things they didn't even know they wanted to hear. He's real. And he's dangerous. You follow Murasaki out afterward. She walks alone again, always alone, but not lonely. She carries her words with her now, like armor, like shadow. She doesn't need to win court favor. She has favor. Not through politics, not through marriage, through prose. And here's a quirky historical side note. In the Heian court scrolls of the Tale of Genji began to circulate like prized secrets. Hand-copied, shared among noblewomen, gifted between lovers, even read aloud during moon-viewing picnics. Some courtiers requested early chapters like gossip. What happens next, they would ask. Does Genji fall again? You smile, he always does. Murasaki retreats to her quarters, and you follow her in silence. The candle is lit. The brush is waiting. The paper sighs as it unrolls. Another scene forms, two lovers in the rain, speaking without looking at each other. Nothing happens. Everything happens. You lie down beside her, or near enough to hear the scratching of ink and the occasional exhale. Not tired exactly, but dream-heavy. The tale of Genji is growing, and Murasaki is growing with it. Not louder, not prouder, just deeper, like water carving its way through stone. It's late again, but time bends strangely here, doesn't it? The palace seems to breathe as you drift through it, gilded shadows stretching, folding, retreating behind silken curtains. The world outside stills. Crickets murmur in the garden. The scent of sandalwood drifts lazily through the air. And somewhere behind a screen, dusted with gold leaf and cherry blossoms, Lady Murasaki writes, "You're back at her side." The scroll before her is long now, its story winding like a river, smooth on the surface, but full of quiet current. The tale of Genji is no longer a mere experiment. It has become something else, larger than gossip, deeper than confession. A portrait of a man too beautiful to be real, too flawed to be fake. But here's where things get murky. You begin to notice something strange as you sit beside her, and read the line between fiction and memory has begun to blur. Is Genji still just a character, or is he in part a ghost from her past? The scene she writes tonight is suspiciously familiar. A nobleman offering comfort to a grieving woman, his tone formal, but his hands too familiar. The woman hesitates. She recites a poem about plum blossoms and missed chances. He replies with one about falling snow and inevitable goodbyes. And you dear eavesdropper can't help but wonder, is this someone she once knew? Historians still argue whether Genji was based on real figures in the Heian court. Some say he was a barely veiled version of Fujiwara, no Michinaga Murasaki's powerful patron, and possibly more. Others insist he was a composite built from fragments of gossip, longing, and sharp observation. One theory even suggests Genji was a warning. This is what happens when beauty goes unchecked. Murasaki herself, of course, left no clear answer. Her diary offers glimpses, yes, but no confirmations. And the tale of Genji is too elegant to be pinned down by something as crude as biography. Still, you sense the emotion in her hand as she writes, a kind of ache woven into the sentences hidden in the pauses between scenes. You ask yourself, is she grieving or just remembering? She leans back for a moment, brush in hand, staring at the paper like it has betrayed her, then continues. Tonight's chapter ends in melancholy. Genji, surrounded by people, feels alone. His charm has faded. His old lovers are gone. His new ones bore him. Even the moon looks unfamiliar. You lie down beside her as she seals the scroll. The lacquer box closes with a soft click, and for the first time in hours, she lets out a full breath. Not a sigh. Just release. The palace is asleep, but your thoughts are not, and neither are hers. You wake, if that's the right word for what happens next, sometime after the candles have guttered out. Murasaki is gone, and you wander quietly into the veranda. The night is clear. A single carp breaks the surface of the garden pond. You watch the ripple until it fades. Then you hear it the faintest rustle of pages turning. Not by her hand. Someone is reading her scroll. You peer around the edge of a sliding door. A noblewoman, one of the Empress's closest companions, holds the manuscript gently between long painted nails. She reads slowly, expression unreadable. At one point, she covers her mouth and exhales sharply surprised laughter, or perhaps recognition. She sets the scroll down with trembling fingers. It's real, you think. The court is reading Genji, not just out of curiosity, but because it speaks to them in a way nothing else does. It's not just about seduction or beauty or grief. It's about being seen. And that's rare in a world where you're trained to be invisible. You return to Murasaki's side later as dawn touches the garden with pale silver. She's awake. Of course she is. She never really sleeps anymore, not since Genji began speaking through her. She says nothing, just lights the inkstone, and begins another scene. Here's a quirky detail to savor. While she writes, the scrolls of the Tale of Genji were often illustrated by court painters, turning them into lavish picture books. These were passed from hand to hand, sometimes with annotations, sometimes with pressed flowers between the pages. Reading Genji wasn't just literature, it was an event. You smile, if only Murasaki knew. Or maybe she did. You watch her brush move in gentle arcs. A new woman enters Genji's life in this chapter. Brilliant, sharp-tongued, and more than a match for him. Their relationship is fraught electric. Their conversations, poetry laced with philosophy, double meanings tucked inside syllables. She's nothing like the others. She might even be a little like Murasaki. You glance at her sideways. She says nothing, but she does smile. Just slightly. The story continues. And you follow willingly. Because here in this world of paper and ink and vanished sighs, everything true hides inside everything imagined. You're floating now, not through dreams exactly, but through paper. Paper soft as breath, scrolls so long they seem to stretch into memory. Words unraveling like a thread you dare not pull lest the whole court unravel with it. Lady Murasaki is not alone in her storytelling anymore. You follow her into a room humming with energy, its silence thick with polite rivalry. Fans flutter like nervous birds, hairpins glitter like quiet daggers, and across the room there she sits, Sei Shonagon, lady-in-waiting to a different empress lover of lists, mistress of razor-sharp observation. Her pillow book is already making the rounds. You've read it. Everyone has. It's delicious, bold, funny, ruthless. She writes things like, things that make the heart beat faster, finding an old poem in your sleeve, hearing your name whispered when it shouldn't be. Also things that should be swept away, spiders, cowardly men, and poorly written poetry. You can't help but chuckle. It's hard not to like her, even harder not to be a little afraid of her. And Murasaki. She reads Sei's work too, though rarely aloud. You sit beside her as she leafs through a copy lip's pursed expression, unreadable. Is she admiring it? Studying it? Judging it? Perhaps all three. Historians still argue whether the two ever truly met. If they spoke, if they sparred with the words, or if the tension between them was imagined by readers centuries later, eager to turn two brilliant women into rivals just because the court wasn't big enough for both of them to shine. But let's be honest, the tension feels real. One writes short, sharp bursts of wit. The other long, melancholic reflections stitched with sorrow. One jabs, the other unravels. Murasaki's Genji is already becoming a sensation in private circles. Passed hand to hand, copied in secret, recited in poetry salons where ladies fan themselves with feigned indifference while hanging on every word. But Sei's pillow book is different. It doesn't ask for interpretation. It commands your attention. You sit in on one of these salons now, low cushions, trays of dried plums and persimmons, scrolls unrolled like river maps across polished floors. Someone reads a passage from Sei, her voice tinged with mischief. Annoying things men who talk too loudly. Women who pretend to cry. Poetry written on the wrong paper. There's laughter, polite, slightly forced. You glance at Murasaki. Her smile doesn't reach her eyes. She doesn't write lists, she writes lives. And tonight she writes late into the night. You follow her back to her chambers, the scent of incense still clinging to her robes, the echo of courtly laughter trailing like mist. She doesn't speak. She never really does. Not while writing. She dips her brush, and Genji dreams again. In tonight's scene, he visits an old lover one he treated badly. Now she's ill-fated. The room smells of wilted flowers. He regrets everything and says nothing. They exchange poems, both pretending not to cry. Then he leaves quietly. You sit there stunned. No plot twist, no dramatic ending, just regret. Quiet and enormous. You suspect this might be Murasaki's answer to Sei Shonagon's sharpness. Not in a letter, not in a list, but in a scene. This is her challenge. Feel this. You do. And apparently so do others. You learn that a rumor has started in the women's quarters that Murasaki has hidden real people inside Genji's pages. One woman insists she's been portrayed as the haughty lady with the thin eyebrows. Another claims the Empress's brother is clearly the tedious noble who recites poems in falsetto. Some are flattered, others are furious. Murasaki says nothing, but her brush keeps moving. Here's a fringe detail you might like. In some circles, courtiers began to commission fan fiction of Genji. They'd write alternate scenes, new lovers, different endings. Some women created paper dolls dressed as Genji's lovers, acting out their own imagined episodes. One lady was said to have scolded her cat for walking across a Genji scroll as if it were sacred scripture. You lie back now, overwhelmed by how a story that began in quiet rebellion has spiraled into obsession. You wonder if Murasaki meant for this to happen. Maybe, but more likely she just wrote what she saw and let the world see itself in the reflection. You glance over at her. She's resting now. Not sleeping, just paused. A single sheet of paper sits beside her. On it, a name, just one. You can't read it. Not clearly. It could be a real name, it could be fiction. But it matters. Because in this palace built on illusion, the most dangerous thing you can do is write something true and sign it. And Lady Murasaki is doing both. Tonight, the court is in bloom. The lanterns are lit early glowing like soft moons in every corner. Music lilts through the corridors, a gentle koto plucked with fingers too elegant to belong to anyone dull. The scent of camellia oil hangs in the air. It's poetry season again. You settle into the cushions beside a gathering of ladies, their robes a shimmering cascade of late spring hues, pale lavender, misty green, cloud, soft white. They look like walking verses themselves. But make no mistake, these women wrapped in 12 layers of elegance are here to battle. The poetry salon begins not with fanfare, but with a sigh. A scroll is passed. A theme is whispered. Rain at dusk. Each woman must compose a tanka, 5 lines, 31 syllables on the spot. No hesitation, no repetition, and ideally, no heartbreak cliches. Ideally. Lady Murasaki, seated in the corner like she always is, watches, listens. She doesn't write yet. That's not her style. The first poem is about a lover gone cold. The second compares the rain to falling ink. The third dares a double meaning, both sensual and seasonal. It earns a ripple of fan-hiding giggles. Then Murasaki lifts her brush, and just 5 lines later, everyone is quiet. Her poem doesn't dazzle. It haunts. Something about a wet robe forgotten on a veranda. Something about silence that soaks deeper than rain. You can't quite explain it. But your chest aches, and so does theirs. She's done it again. This is what separates her. The others write poems. Murasaki writes emotions that linger like smoke. You trail her afterward through the hall where lanterns sway in the evening wind. A young courtier stops her bowing nervous and dares to ask, "Is Genji based on someone I know?" She smiles politely, says nothing, which is not a no. Later in private, you hear her whisper something astonishing. Poetry is just conversation in better clothes. You grin. She's not wrong. Heian courtship is almost entirely conducted through poems. Want to flirt? Send a poem. Want to apologize? Send a better one. Want to end a relationship? Send a haiku with heavy seasonal imagery and hope they take the hint. And these aren't just rhymes on scraps. The paper matters. The scent matters. Even the brushstroke is judged. Did you compose it at dawn? That's bold. At twilight romantic? On a stormy day, you're practically proposing. You recall one bizarre detail. You overheard a noblewoman once rejected a suitor solely because his calligraphy lacked confidence. Another was mocked for choosing the wrong kind of plum blossom stationery. A third gained infamy for sending a poem that accidentally formed a rude pun. He left the palace in disgrace. Poetry was war. And in this world, Murasaki is a general. But here's the twist: she rarely fights back. She doesn't need to. She writes not to impress, but to express. Her scenes are not about triumph. They're about truth. About people who want to be loved but don't know how, who reach out and miss, who whisper verses to empty rooms. In tonight's new Genji chapter, she writes a scene where a woman replies to a love poem. 5 years too late. He has moved on. She has not. Her reply arrives in spring, scented with nostalgia and mold. It says, "I waited, then wilted." That's it. That's the whole poem. You sit in stunned silence. Who writes that? Only someone who's been there. Only someone who knows what it feels like to wait too long for someone who never knew you were waiting. You glance at Murasaki. She doesn't look up. She just keeps writing. Historians still debate how autobiographical the tale of Genji really is. Did she love someone she couldn't have? Was she mourning a life unlived? Or was it all simply the product of a vast empathic imagination? Maybe she's hiding behind her fiction. Or maybe she's revealing more than anyone dares. As the evening winds down, you rest beside her on a soft cushion near the inkstone. The brush lies beside the scroll, now its tip still glistening. She's just finished another chapter, this one full of metaphors about rain memory, and the soft regret that follows laughter too quickly. She leans back, stretches her fingers, and stares out at the moon through a half-open screen. For a moment, the world outside and the one in her scroll seem to merge. You feel the weight of it, this life where poetry is politics, where silence speaks volumes and where fiction tells more truth than the history books ever could. You drift slowly into a doze warmed by candlelight and story, and somewhere behind you, Lady Murasaki picks up her brush again. Because poetry season never really ends. The palace is quieter than usual tonight. Even the usual flutter of fans and murmured gossip seems muffled, like the whole court has drawn its breath and forgotten how to exhale. Outside, the moon is nearly full, suspended above the garden, like a lantern on silk thread. The night feels important, and you can tell something's changing. You move softly through the corridors drawn by a hush that feels heavier than silence. And then you see her, Lady Murasaki, seated in the formal reception hall, her posture composed, her eyes focused, a fresh scroll laid before her. She is not alone. In front of her courtiers, men, ministers, a representative of the emperor himself, and they're asking her to read. Not gossip, not poems, but Genji. Yes, you heard right. You slide closer, careful not to disturb the stillness. This is new territory. Women write, yes, but not like this. Not epics. Not works that command the attention of powerful men. But Murasaki reads anyway. Her voice is soft but steady. She reads the scene where Genji meets a woman who doesn't fall for him immediately. Unheard of. Scandalous. He fumbles, unsure of himself. It's a rare moment, vulnerability disguised in elegance. You glance at the men. Some look amused, others thoughtful. One shifts uncomfortably. Another nods just once. Then silence again. And that's when it hits you. This isn't just entertainment anymore. It's politics. They're listening not just to the story, but to the underneath of it. The veiled critiques, the reflections of courtly life, the carefully couched advice. Genji is not simply a charming lover. He is a mirror, a cautionary tale, a man who could be any of them. Historians still argue whether this reading was an honor, a test, or a trap. Was she being celebrated or scrutinized? Did the court truly admire her craft, or were they measuring the power of her words in the weight of political consequence? It's impossible to say. But Murasaki, she reads on, unflinching. Later that night, you find her sitting alone again back in her quiet chamber, fingers wrapped around a ceramic teacup. She sips slowly, her expression unreadable. You ask her quietly if she's proud. She doesn't answer with words. She simply unrolls a new scroll, dips her brush, and begins again. Because this story, her story, isn't finished. You sit with her as the ink dries. She's writing a chapter where Genji receives a visit from his own son, a child who may not even be his. The air between them is thick with unspoken things. Regret, affection, confusion. You feel all of it, and none of it is said directly. That's her gift. She writes in whispers, and you hear it like thunder. And here's a detail no one told you before. Murasaki may have been summoned to write Genji for the court, as a distraction, as an example of ideal behavior, or even as subtle propaganda. The emperor's wife, Empress Shoshi, was locked in a power struggle with her rival and a tale glorifying refined, poetic men who loved beautifully might just serve the image they wanted. But Murasaki took that assignment, if it was one, and wrote something far more dangerous. She didn't create a role model. She created a warning. Genji is adored, yes, but he is also deeply flawed. His beauty doesn't save him from his consequences. His charm doesn't protect the women around him from heartbreak. He is not a hero. He is, in a word, human, and so is she. You sit with her for hours, no words spoken, just brush and scroll, chapter after chapter unfolding. She's tired. You can see it now, the slight tremble in her hand, the pause between lines. But she writes anyway, because something deeper drives her now. Not duty, not fame, Something closer to clarity. She's no longer just observing the court. She's preserving it. One sigh, one mistake, one longing glance at a time. The world around her is polished and perfect on the outside, but crumbling gently beneath the weight of its own rituals. The emperors change, the alliances shift, but Genji remains, and in him she traps everything the court cannot say aloud. You glance down at the newest passage. It ends with Genji watching the rain fall, wondering if his greatest mistake was not what he did, but what he left unsaid. You close your eyes and hear nothing but the steady drip of the past becoming fiction. Rain again. You recognize the sound even before you open your eyes, the slow, deliberate patter against paper screens and polished tiles. A soft rhythm like footsteps retreating. Outside, the world has turned to watercolor. Ink runs, petals droop. The palace shrinks into itself beneath the clouds. Lady Murasaki sits alone in a corner chamber, watching the rain fall sideways through a half-open shutter. She hasn't written anything yet today. You settle beside her. There's a stillness about her now, not the measured calm of a court lady, maintaining composure, but something deeper, quieter, like standing at the edge of something and not knowing if it's a beginning or an end. She doesn't speak, but she lets you stay. The air smells of damp cedar and old paper. You glance toward her writing desk. The scroll is unrolled but untouched. The brush rests across its inkstone like a sword laid down. Murasaki hasn't stopped writing because she's out of words. She's just tired. It's been years since she first began the Tale of Genji, and the story is long now. Some chapters feel like silk flowing effortless. Others are like tightly stitched embroidery, every thread hiding pain. Genji himself has aged. His beauty still spoken of, but now tinged with melancholy. His conquests more burden than brag. The women around him grow old, die, or disappear. His lovers become memories he cannot return to. And that's the heart of it, isn't it? Impermanence. Mono no aware. That subtle aching awareness that everything beautiful must fade. That cherry blossoms bloom only to fall. That even the brightest moon casts long shadows. You remember her earlier chapters, bright, romantic, clever. But lately her tone has shifted. Genji grieves more, he smiles less, and she withdraws further into herself. Historians still debate whether Murasaki chose to retreat from court life, or whether she was slowly, quietly pushed. Some suggest political tensions, others whisper of grief. There's mention of her daughter dying young, of friends leaving, of Empress Shoshi losing power, the court changing around her. And through it all, Murasaki wrote, you watch her now as she finally lifts the brush. A new chapter begins not with love, but with absence. Genji walks through a garden where a lover once stood. He imagines her laughter, smells her perfume in a flower that's no longer blooming. He writes her a poem knowing she will never read it. You don't need context. You feel it. Murasaki isn't writing fiction anymore. She's writing ghosts. She finishes the passage and leans back. Her eyes close. The brush returns to the inkstone with a soft clink. Outside, the rain continues. You wonder if she knows how revolutionary this is. That no one has written like this before. That she's created a new kind of story, long, emotional, layered, filled with subtlety and sorrow. But she never calls it a novel. That word doesn't exist here. She calls it Monogatari, a tale, a story, a thread through time. Here's a little-known detail. Some readers of Genji began to view the story as instructional, a guide to proper behavior and courtly sensitivity. Others took it as confession. Still others believed it contained spiritual wisdom. One monk reportedly copied a chapter onto a scroll and buried it beneath a cherry tree to bless it with longevity. Another used a passage as part of a funeral rite. Fiction, prayer, memory, it all bled together. And maybe that's what Murasaki intended. Or maybe she didn't intend anything. Maybe she just wrote what she couldn't say aloud. You remain with her long into the night. The candle flickers, the ink dries. The court is silent. She dreams now, if only for a moment, head resting on her arm, lips parted slightly, brow furrowed even in sleep. She's writing still, even there. In her dream, perhaps she walks with Genji one last time. Perhaps they say goodbye. Or nothing at all, because some goodbyes are better left unwritten. It's morning, but no one rushes. The light that spills across the veranda is golden and slow like honey poured from a too small jar. Outside, cicadas hum their eternal song of endings and beginnings. Inside, the palace yawns gently. The court has become quieter these days, less laughter, fewer poems whispered behind painted fans. Seasons have passed. People have aged. And you've stayed close. Lady Murasaki, too, has changed. She still wears the layers, still paints her brows high and whitewashes her face like moonlight. But there's less ceremony to her now, less performance. She doesn't walk with retinues of ladies-in-waiting. She rarely attends salons anymore. The court's attention has drifted to newer names, brighter faces, younger poets desperate to rhyme moon with regret. But she remains, not center stage, just quietly off to the side. Writing, always writing. You sit beside her once again, watching as she unrolls another scroll. There's something different in her hands, a steadiness, a knowing. This isn't ambition anymore. This isn't obligation. This is legacy. The Tale of Genji is nearly complete now. You can feel it in the rhythm of her scenes, longer silences, heavier reflections, characters visiting shrines, watching fog, writing letters they never send. Genji himself has passed on finally. The last chapters no longer center him. The tale shifts to his descendants, his lovers' children, the quiet echoes of decisions made long ago. It's no longer a story about a man. It's a story about what remains when beauty fades. Murasaki pauses. You glance down at the scroll. A line reads, "Even in dreams, I cannot find her face." She doesn't say who her is. She never does. But you wonder if she's writing about one of Genji's lovers or someone from her own life. Maybe her daughter. Maybe the Empress. Maybe herself. Historians still argue how much of Murasaki's own experience made it into the tale. Did she see Genji's regrets as her own? Did she hide in the voices of his lovers, each one a fragment of her own spirit? Or was she, as some claim, simply an observer, recording the world with the precision of a poet and the detachment of a ghost? You'll never know. But you're certain of this: her words have outlived her world. The emperors who once ruled here have names carved in stone, but few stories. The men who filled the court with ritual and politics, gone forgotten, dust in lacquered boxes. But Murasaki, her ink still breathes. You've seen it now, haven't you? The way her scrolls pass from hand to hand. The way noblewomen press Genji to their hearts when no one's looking. The way courtiers quote her scenes without admitting they memorized them. Some even write sequels. Some attempt new endings. One lady, desperate for connection, penned a letter to Genji and burned it under a full moon, hoping his ghost might answer. The fiction has become scripture. The character's more real than the ones who once sat on the chrysanthemum throne. And here's a delicious detail centuries after her death. Murasaki's tale would be bound, translated, illustrated, and studied by scholars who still cannot agree on whether she invented the novel or merely stumbled into it. Western academics would debate her influence on world literature. Artists would sketch Genji with faces she never imagined. And still her name, Toku Lady Murasaki, would remain, though it's not really her name. Not exactly. Shikibu comes from her father's court title. Murasaki was a character from her own story, a clever, sorrowful woman Genji loved best. Her real name, possibly Fujiwara. no Takako, but no one's sure. She named herself with fiction, and now fiction is how she survives. You sit with her one last time as she finishes the scene. A young woman writes a letter to a man she's never met, telling him what kind of person she wants to be. Not what she is, but what she hopes to become. Murasaki leans back, closes her eyes, and for a moment you wonder if she sees you. Maybe, maybe not. But even if she doesn't, she knew you would come. She wrote for someone like you. Someone who watches, who listens, who aches quietly and wonders why beauty fades and whether memory is enough. You exhale, and the scroll gently rolls closed. You walk the palace alone now, not because Murasaki is gone, but because she has withdrawn so far into silence, she has become like the paper she writes on, thin, pale, and nearly transparent. A whisper of her former self. She still breathes, still eats, still folds her robes. But her voice, always quiet, is quieter still. You begin to wonder if she's slowly fading into her own story. The court has changed. You notice it in the footsteps. Lighter, quicker, less burdened by ceremony. The Empress Shoshi no longer holds sway as she once did. The salons still happen, yes, but with new faces. The poetry competitions feel louder, less careful. People smile more, but think less. You don't hear Genji's name so often, but you do see the scrolls. Still passed around like relics. Still read late at night by candlelight. Still whispered about. Because something strange has happened. Something you didn't expect. Murasaki no longer. The court's shining wit has become something more enduring. An author. Not a lady, not a decoration, not a courtier with clever turns of phrase, but a creator, the voice of a whole generation, perhaps more. And yet, she sits behind a screen day after day, refusing to step forward. She no longer joins the salons, no longer walks the garden path. She just writes or rewrites. You catch her, revising an early chapter one afternoon, brushing out a line, smoothing a sentence, changing the order of a scene that's already been copied and read 100 times. When you ask her why, she answers, without looking up, "I didn't say it quite right." You nod. Because, the writing is all that's left. The court moves on. Politics shift. Titles change hands. But the story stays. Historians still wonder why Murasaki retreated from public life. Some say she fell out of favor. Others whisper of scandal or grief or illness. A few believe she chose exile, deliberately, tired of performing elegance, exhausted by expectation. You watch her now, fingers, pale ink, staining the cuffs of her sleeves. She doesn't weep, but her characters do. In this newest chapter, Genji's descendants struggle under his shadow. They love poorly. They make the same mistakes. They carry the same ache for perfection, and it costs them dearly. No war, no rebellion, just the long, soft tragedy of living in someone else's story. You begin to realize this is no longer a tale of romance. This is a tale of legacy. And Murasaki is writing her own into the margins. Here's a curious, overlooked detail. Some of the final Genji scrolls bear tiny corrections in red ink. Subtle edits, thought to be Murasaki's own, added long after the original composition. Small changes. A word here, a syllable there, just enough to shift the mood. You wonder what those changes meant. Were they improvements, regrets, final thoughts whispered to a world she no longer wished to face? One night you find her sitting on the veranda in the blue shadow before dawn. She's not writing, just watching the garden. Her hair is loose, her face bare. She looks less like the famous Lady Murasaki and more like someone you once knew in a dream. You sit beside her, and she finally speaks. Not of Genji, not of poetry, but of paper. "It's strange," she says. "You give your thoughts to something that tears so easily." Then she hands you a scroll. "It's not Genji. It's something smaller, unfinished, a fragment. You read, "When the world becomes too loud, I fold myself into a poem. There, I breathe softer." You don't ask what it means. You don't need to. You stay with her until the sun rises, until the mist burns off the pond and the world begins again. Murasaki stands, folds her robes. She does not bow. She simply walks away back into the palace, into memory, into fiction. And the scroll in your lap is warm from her hands. The palace is dust now. Not literally, not yet, but close. The wood groans more. The gardens bloom less. And the laughter that once floated through the corridors like incense has faded into occasional echoes. You walk slowly through the halls, remembering what once was the sharp snap of fans, the silken murmur of rivalries, the poetry that tasted like longing. But now, you are alone with paper. Lady Murasaki no longer walks these halls. Her footsteps left long ago. Whether she faded quietly into illness, chose to vanish into seclusion, or simply stopped being seen, no one quite remembers. The records taper off. Even her name becomes ghost-like. Lady Murasaki, Shikibu, Fujiwara no Takako, or perhaps someone else entirely. A woman who left behind more questions than certainty. Historians still argue where she was buried, whether she saw her work finished, whether she even knew what she had done. You sit in her chamber now, her writing space still intact. The inkstone is dry. The brush is brittle. The scrolls are rolled neatly tied with silk cords, faded to pale threads. A draft of Genji's final chapter lies open. You read. The tale ends not with triumph, but with distance. Genji is long dead. His children grow up shadowed by his reputation, burdened by his absence. One seeks love and finds only illusion. Another flees the court, trying to find meaning in isolation. A third writes poetry to the moon, hoping the moon might care. And then silence. No final line. No grand farewell. Just a character standing by a misty river, watching his reflection disappear in the ripples. You sit with that image for a long while. Then you look around. The court is gone. The names, the titles, the hairpins and perfumes and schemes, they've all dissolved into history's blur. But here you are holding a story that still speaks. That's the miracle, isn't it? Murasaki's world, so fragile, so ephemeral, survived because she wrote it down. She turned sighs into sentences, glances into scenes. She turned loneliness into art and politics into poetry. And she did it quietly. No declarations, no demands. Just brush, ink, breath, and perhaps most extraordinary of all, she never told anyone what it meant, because she knew you'd come looking. You rise now from the floor, placing the scroll gently back in its box. The room is warm from the late morning sun. Outside, the wind lifts a single blossom from a tree whose roots remember her footsteps. You step into the garden one last time, and listen. You hear nothing, but you feel it. The words are still here, in the leaves, in the dust, in the silence that speaks louder than court proclamations ever did. Lady Murasaki is gone, but her story, her real story, never needed an ending, because it was always meant to continue in someone else. Maybe in you, maybe in anyone who understands the ache of beauty, the burden of memory. The gentle, steady power of someone who writes not to be seen, but to see. And now you're still. The palace is quiet, the pages are closed, the ink is dry. You've walked with a woman whose name may never be certain, but whose voice, soft, deliberate, unshakable, has rippled through 1,000 years. You've sat beside her as she turned silence into story, heartbreak into chapters, and a whispering court into something that could outlive time itself. Not with power, not with armies, not with declarations, but with observation. She saw people, saw them clearly, saw the tragedy behind the gestures, the loneliness behind the performances, the humanity beneath the silk. And she wrote it down, slowly, gently, like rain slipping down a reed screen. You don't need to remember every character, every poem, every rivalry. You only need to remember this, that a woman once sat in the shadows of a dazzling court and quietly reshaped the world through fiction. So let your thoughts slow now. Let the flickering scenes in your mind soften to still images like illustrations on a faded scroll. You are safe. You are resting. You are being gently held by words that once meant everything to someone long ago. The tale is over. Or maybe it never truly ends. The ink may fade, but the feeling remains. Soft dreams now. Murasaki is still writing. Just for you.